Dear friends, I invite you to listen to a new story on my Purple Heart Stories channel. Chapter 1: Suspicion. Steve Connor never thought he would have to follow his own wife. At 42, he was one of the best FBI agents in the narcotics division, and his wife Lisa, a 39-year-old corporate lawyer, had always been his reliable support. At least, that was until he noticed how she began to change after the disappearance of their daughter Ashley 7 years ago. Now, clutching a camera with a telephoto lens, he tried to convince himself that there had to be a logical explanation for everything. But the longer he watched, the stronger the feeling grew that their life was about to shatter into pieces. The first changes in Lisa's behavior were barely noticeable, like a light ripple on the surface of a calm lake. At first, it was just calls she answered by going to another room. Then, unscheduled meetings with clients became more frequent, stretching late into the night. Steve began to notice how she would flinch at every unexpected sound, how she avoided looking him in the eye at breakfast. Her self-confidence, which had always impressed him, seemed to have evaporated, leaving behind only a shadow of the former Lisa. That evening he decided to follow her. Parking an inconspicuous gray sedan a sufficient distance from the Italian restaurant Giuseppe's in the city center, he watched his wife go inside. Through the large windows, he saw her take a table in the back of the room. A waiter brought her a glass of white wine, which she didn't even touch, nervously glancing at the entrance door. The appearance of Ramon Ortega made Steve feel a chill. He knew this man well, one of the biggest drug lords on the West Coast, whom the FBI had been unsuccessfully trying to catch for the past 5 years. The tall, well-dressed Mexican radiated a calm self-assurance. He kissed Lisa on the cheek, like an old acquaintance, and sat down opposite her. The sound of the camera shutter seemed deafening to Steve in the silence of the car. The next morning began for Steve long before dawn. He sat in his home office, methodically reviewing printouts of his wife's phone calls for the past 3 months, dozens of calls from anonymous numbers registered to shell corporations. Some lasted only a few seconds, others stretched for hours. A frightening picture was emerging. Even more alarming was the analysis of Lisa's recent court cases. In the past year, she had lost 7 cases involving Ortega's drug cartel. In all cases, the evidence was strong. The witness testimony was convincing, but somehow key evidence was compromised or disappeared right before the hearings. It couldn't be a coincidence. Steve didn't want to do it. The very thought of installing a listening device in his own home made him feel sick. But when he took a box of surveillance equipment from the closet the next day, his hands didn't tremble. He acted methodically, as if preparing for a regular operation. Miniature cameras the size of buttons took their places in the living room and kitchen. Directional microphones, capable of picking up whispers through the wall, were installed in Lisa's office. After finishing the installation, he connected all the devices to a secure server in the basement. 2 days of recording yielded nothing unusual. Lisa worked late as usual. She talked on the phone with clients, prepared documents. On the 3rd day, everything changed. At 11:17 p.m., the phone rang. Steve, who was reviewing the recordings in his office at work, saw Lisa flinch as she looked at the phone screen. She quickly went to the backyard, but the directional microphone clearly picked up every word. "I understand that the conditions are satisfactory," Lisa's voice sounded muffled, as if she were speaking through gritted teeth. "But I have to see her, even for a few minutes. No, I'm not doing anything foolish. I know what's at stake. Yes, of course. Tomorrow at the same time." Steve leaned back in his chair, feeling the blood pounding in his temples. Conditions? What on earth was she talking about? The first thought was an affair. His wife, his Lisa. Had she been leading a double life all these years? He remembered how she cried at night after the disappearance of their daughter Ashley, how they tried to cope with the grief together. Or was that just pretending too? Ortega's country villa was an hour's drive from the city. The luxurious colonial-style mansion was surrounded by a park with perfectly manicured lawns. Steve parked his car half a mile from the main gate, on the side of a country road. The directional microphone was mounted on a tripod and camouflaged with branches. Through the optical sight, he saw Lisa get out of her silver sedan at the front entrance. Ortega greeted her himself, which was unusual for a man in his position. He led her into the garden where they could talk without witnesses, but even there, their voices reached the sensitive microphone diaphragm. "Your daughter is becoming a real beauty, Lisa," Ortega's voice oozed honey. "So much like you in your youth, although her character is more willful." Steve's heart skipped a beat. "Daughter," he blinked, sure he had misheard, but Lisa's next words made him feel a chill. "Don't you dare threaten Ashley." His wife's voice was filled with a rage he had never heard before. "I'm doing everything you ask. You control my whole life and body. The documents for those 2 cases will be ready by Wednesday, but everything with Ashley has to be as we agreed. You can take me whenever you want, but don't you dare lay a finger on her." That night Steve couldn't sleep. Ortega's words about Ashley rang in his ears. At 3 in the morning, he parked near the office building where Lisa's law firm was located. The security guard at the entrance knew him as the husband of one of the senior partners and just gave him a friendly nod. Lisa's office was on the 14th floor. The lock gave way in 30 seconds. The skills he learned at the FBI Academy were still there. He methodically searched the office, trying not to leave a trace. Desk drawers, filing cabinets, safe, nothing. His attention was drawn to an old photo on the desk, the 3 of them on the beach, Ashley building a sandcastle. Steve remembered that day. It was a month before she disappeared. He mechanically lifted the frame and froze. Underneath it was a small flash drive. It was quiet in the office, only the laptop hummed. The flash drive contained dozens of photos, sorted by date. They were of Ashley, no longer the little girl he remembered, but a teenager. Thin, in a maid's uniform, she was cleaning windows in a luxurious mansion, setting the table, watering flowers in the conservatory. The last photo was taken just a week ago. 7 years. For 7 years his daughter had been alive, working as a maid for a drug lord, and he thought she was dead. And his wife knew everything. His head was pounding as he drove home. The events of the last few days formed a monstrous picture. Ortega kidnapped Ashley to blackmail Lisa, forced her to work for the cartel, destroy evidence, botch cases in court. And she had kept silent all these years, fearing for her daughter's life. And of course, he must have threatened them both with death if the truth came out. Behind the wheel, Steve felt a cold rage building inside. He turned on the police scanner. The airwaves were filled with routine calls, thefts, fights, domestic incidents. A couple of times, the call signs of officers he knew personally flashed by. Some of them were definitely on the cartel's payroll. Steve had long suspected it, but couldn't prove it. Now he understood why the investigation into Ashley's disappearance had stalled 7 years ago. The system was thoroughly corrupt. Parking near the house, he sat in the car for a long time, looking at the illuminated windows of the bedroom. Lisa wasn't asleep. He could see her silhouette by the window. Maybe she was waiting for another call from Ortega, or maybe she just couldn't sleep like himself. Taking official action was pointless. Too many people in the police and prosecutor's office were bought by the cartel. There was only one way left. He took out his phone and dialed the number of his boss at the FBI. "Jim, it's Connor. I need a vacation." "Yes, right now. Family circumstances. 3 weeks will be enough. Thanks, I knew I could count on you." He got out of the car. In the trunk was a bag of military equipment he had kept for a rainy day. Looks like that day has arrived. It was time to bring his daughter home. And if he had to destroy Ortega's empire to do it, well, he was willing to pay that price. Chapter 2: Preparation. Rain drummed on the windshield of the old Ford, parked on a hill overlooking Ortega's villa. Steve had been behind the wheel for 6 hours, methodically filming everyone coming and going. 3 weeks of vacation, not much for an operation of this scale, but there was no time to waste. He had spent 7 years believing his daughter was dead. Now every day of delay felt like a crime. Ortega's villa resembled a medieval fortress, disguised as a luxurious Spanish-style mansion. A 4-meter fence around the perimeter, barbed wire disguised with decorative ivy. Security cameras artfully hidden in the stucco, motion sensors in the garden, and most importantly, security. Professionals, not just bouncers from a nightclub. They moved smoothly, like a single mechanism, regularly changing positions and patrol routes. Steve paid special attention to a tall man with a military bearing, whom the other guards called Shadow. Mark Baker, according to the documents. He practically never left Ortega, following him like a silent, deadly shadow. Even through binoculars, it was clear how well-trained he was as he scanned the space around his boss, instantly assessing any potential threat. At noon, a truck with groceries drove up to the main gate. The security guards checked it for almost 20 minutes before letting it in. Steve noted the time in his notebook. Such deliveries took place every Tuesday and Friday. A possible loophole, though a risky one. The driver was probably thoroughly checked before being allowed to work. In the evening, returning to his rented apartment on the outskirts of the city, Steve laid out the pictures he had taken in recent days on the table. Among them were several good shots of the inner courtyard, taken with a drone disguised as a bird. He methodically marked the locations of security posts, surveillance cameras, and supposed blind spots on the villa plan. The picture was discouraging. Getting inside unnoticed seemed almost impossible. One of his phones rang, the one whose number was known only to a few people in the intelligence services. It was Mike Turner, his old friend from military intelligence. "Got what you asked for," Mike said without preamble. "But you owe me big time. Floor plan of the villa, security system, guard shift schedule, it's all here. The files will be sent to your secure email. And listen, be careful. Ortega isn't one to leave witnesses." Steve downloaded the files to a laptop not connected to the network. The documents turned out to be even more detailed than he had expected. Ventilation, electrical wiring, and sewage diagrams. Guard shift schedules accurate to the minute. He was particularly interested in the servants' wing, a small 2-story building connected to the main mansion by a covered walkway. If Ashley really was working as a maid, she must live there. He opened a can of beer and leaned back in his chair, looking at the night city outside the window. Somewhere there, less than an hour away, his daughter was getting ready for bed in her servants' quarters. Was she sleeping peacefully? Did she remember him and Lisa? Or had everything been erased from her memory over the past 7 years? He had to find a way to get inside. He had to bring her home, at any cost. Steve spent the next 3 days preparing the gear. He methodically visited hunting stores in different parts of the city, never staying longer than 15 minutes anywhere. In one, he bought a military-grade night vision device. In another, climbing gear. He had to order a special suppressor for his pistol through old military connections. Carabiners, ropes, gloves with pads for silent movement. All of this was put into a large sports bag in the trunk of an inconspicuous gray car rented under a false name. In the evening, he set up 3 safe houses in different parts of the city. The first was in an old industrial building converted into lofts. The second was in a respectable residential complex with underground parking. The third was in the suburbs, in a quiet residential area. Each had supplies of food, water, medicine, and a set of clean clothes. If something went wrong, he and Ashley should have several escape options. Reviewing another batch of photos of the villa's security, Steve suddenly froze. Something about Mark Baker's face seemed familiar. He zoomed in on the photo, peering at the features of Ortega's chief bodyguard. Military bearing, a characteristic scar on his chin. He had seen this man somewhere before. Steve opened his laptop and ran a search through old military databases. Mark Shadow Baker had been listed as missing in action 8 years ago. Prior to that, an impeccable service record in special forces, numerous successful operations, awards for valor, and then a disappearance without a trace during a vacation. Steve scrolled through the file to the photo and felt a chill run down his spine. The 8-year-old photo showed their platoon in Afghanistan. He himself was standing in the center, and next to him, putting his hand on his shoulder, a young Mark Baker was smiling. Memories flooded back like a wave. That ambush in the mountains when the Taliban pinned them down in a gorge. Heavy fire, cries of the wounded, the smell of burning metal. Mark covered the group's retreat then, holding the position alone. Steve went back for him, pulled him out from under fire with a shot leg. Then they lay together in the hospital, making plans for the future. Mark talked about his girlfriend Sarah, about how he would propose to her after returning. "Lord Mark," Steve whispered, looking at the recent photos of his former comrade next to Ortega. "How did you come to this?" The night was moonless. Black clouds covered the sky, promising rain. Steve lay in the wet grass on the hill, looking at the villa through a night vision device. The perimeter was lit, but there were dark gaps between the spotlights. The security system seemed perfect, but any system has weaknesses. You just have to know where to look. He waited for the sentries to make their rounds and began to slowly move towards the fence. The black clothing made him almost invisible in the dark. 15 meters. 10. 5. The motion sensors were cleverly placed, but Steve had studied their location. The main thing was to move at the right rhythm, getting into the blind spots between scans. The first shot rang out when he had almost reached the wall. The bullet hit the ground a few inches from his foot. Steve rolled, moving out of the line of fire, but the second shot was even closer. The shooter was darn good. A siren wailed. Figures of guards appeared from the darkness, quickly surrounding his position. Steve threw a flashbang grenade and rushed to the trees. The flash blinded the pursuers for a moment, but he knew it was only a temporary respite. As he made his way through the bushes, he heard the guards combing the area. They were driving him to the eastern part of the fence, where a steep slope blocked his retreat. Suddenly, a flashlight beam snatched his figure from the darkness. Steve turned, drawing his pistol, but froze. Mark Baker stood before him, holding him at gunpoint. In the light of the flashlight, his face seemed carved from stone. "Kneel, slowly," Mark's voice was as cold as ice. Steve obeyed, sinking to the wet ground. The rain finally started, drumming on the leaves of the trees. Mark approached, not lowering his weapon. His hand reached out to tear the mask from the face of the intruder, but suddenly stopped. In the light of the flashlight, Steve's army dog tags gleamed on his neck, the same ones he wore in Afghanistan. Mark knew those tags. He himself had engraved Steve's name on them with his pocket knife when they were lying in ambush in the Tora Bora Mountains. "Lord Steve," Mark breathed, lowering his pistol. His face reflected shock. "What the heck are you doing here?" "I can't explain everything to you in a nutshell right now, Mark," Steve replied quietly. "I'll tell you everything later, but just go away and forget you saw me. Please." They looked at each other for a long second. Somewhere in the distance, the shouts of the guards approaching their position could be heard. Mark raised his pistol and fired twice into the air. "He went west," he shouted into the radio. "Pursuing, everyone scatter and block the western perimeter." Then he turned to Steve and said through his teeth, "You have 2 minutes. Run. And don't show your face here again, or next time I'll shoot to kill." Steve disappeared into the darkness. Already at the car, he heard Mark report on the radio, "Area is clear. The intruder escaped into the forest. Continue the search." He knew it was a lie, and he knew that he now had an unexpected trump card in the upcoming game. He just needed to play it right. Chapter 3: The Deal. Joe's Bar was exactly the kind of establishment where a former Special Forces soldier could quietly have a drink without attracting attention. Smoky air, dim light, a worn bar that had seen better days. The regulars were mostly workers from nearby warehouses and handymen from the shipyard. Steve sat in a corner, sipping whiskey and watching the entrance door. He knew that sooner or later Mark would show up here. He had been here 3 times in the last week after his shift. Baker entered exactly at 10, as he had on previous days. He took a professional look at the room, instantly assessing the situation. His gaze lingered on Steve for a split second, but his face remained impassive. He walked to the bar, ordered a double bourbon, and settled down 2 tables away from his former comrade. "You've always been a poor tale, Steve," he said quietly, not turning his head. "I spotted you 3 days ago." "Didn't try very hard to disguise myself." Steve moved to his table, placing a bottle of Jack Daniels between them. "We need to talk, Mark." For a while they were silent, looking at each other. Years had changed them both. Wrinkles had appeared in the corners of Mark's eyes, and silver-gray hair covered his temples. But the main change was in his gaze, cold, assessing, as if he were constantly calculating the distance to the target. "Remember that day in Kandahar?" Steve finally asked, filling the glasses. "When we were ambushed in the gorge?" "You pulled me out with a shot leg," Mark nodded. "I'm still in your debt for that." "What happened later, Mark? Why did you disappear?" Baker downed his glass in one gulp. His fingers were slightly trembling, betraying inner tension. "My mom got sick, cancer stage 4. The insurance only covered basic treatment, and experimental therapy cost crazy money. I tried to find legal ways, but time was running out." He paused, looking at the amber liquid in his glass. At a nearby table, a group of dockworkers laughed loudly, but neither Steve nor Mark even turned their heads toward them. "Ortega offered me a job," Mark continued after a pause. "He said that with my skills I would quickly earn the amount needed. I agreed, thinking it's temporary. I'll work for a year, collect the money for treatment, and leave. But you know how it goes. There's no easy way out of this business." "What about Sarah and your son?" Mark's face faltered. "They think I'm dead. It's better for everyone. I couldn't go back to them after what I've done. I couldn't risk their safety." "My daughter is alive, Mark," Steve said quietly. "She's on Ortega's estate all these 7 years." Mark sharply raised his head. Understanding flashed in his eyes. "That's why you tried to break into the villa. Darn, I should have guessed." Steve leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Help me, Mark. You know all the security systems, all the weaknesses. Together we can get her out." Mark was silent for a long time, staring into the space in front of him. His fingers mechanically spun the glass, leaving wet marks on the worn table top. Somewhere in the back of the bar, Johnny Cash was singing soulfully about a man in black walking the line. "You don't understand what you're getting into, Steve," he finally said. "Ortega isn't just a drug dealer. He's obsessed with control, with power over people. If we mess up, he won't just kill us. He'll destroy everyone we care about." "I have no choice," Steve shook his head. "She's my daughter. I have to try." "What about your family? Sarah, Jake?" Steve pressed the sore spot. "They still love you. They're waiting. You can go back to them, start a new life." Mark's knuckles turned white with tension. "I'm not the person they remember anymore." "But you're still the person who had my back in Kandahar. The one who saved half our platoon by holding the position alone." Mark looked up, and Steve saw in them a glimmer of his former friend. That young guy who showed pictures of his girlfriend and dreamed of his own house with a white fence. "All right," he breathed after a long pause. "I'll help you, but we'll do it my way." For the next hour, they pored over a diagram of the villa that Mark had sketched on a napkin. His plan was simple and effective. He would stage the discovery and elimination of an unknown spy to lull Ortega's vigilance. That would give them time to prepare. "The east wing is guarded the weakest," Mark explained, making notes on the diagram. "I can create a window in the surveillance system for 10 minutes, no more. You'll have to act fast." He took out his smartphone and showed Steve the guard shift schedule. "The main security team changes at 3 in the morning. The new shift spends the first 15 minutes doing an internal inspection of the building. That's our chance." 2 days from now," Steve nodded. "I need to prepare escape routes and a safe haven." "I'll report to Ortega that I tracked down and eliminated you tonight." Mark finished his whiskey. "That should reassure him, but remember one mistake and we're dead. That same evening, Steve met with Lisa at their old place, a small cafe on the outskirts of town where they had once celebrated her first one case. Now the room seemed smaller and darker than he remembered. Or maybe it was just that time had changed them both so much that even familiar places looked different. Lisa looked exhausted. Dark circles under her eyes, nervous movements, a constantly wandering gaze, all betrayed a person living in constant fear. When Steve told her about the plan, she turned even paler. "It's madness," she whispered, clutching a cup of cold coffee. "You don't know Ortega like I do. He enjoys power over people. When he took Ashley, he made me watch a video where she was crying and calling for us. Every time I tried to go to the police, he sent new recordings with threats." "Why didn't you tell me?" Steve asked quietly, fighting down his rising rage. "He promised to kill her if I told anyone," her voice trembled. "And then it was too late. I was too deep into all this. Destroyed evidence, botched cases. I became an accomplice." Steve covered her hand with his. It was ice cold. "Listen to me," he said. "We have a chance to fix everything. A man on the inside who will help us, will bring Ashley home. Are you sure you can trust him? He saved my life in Afghanistan, and I saved his. Things like that aren't forgotten." Lisa nodded slowly, as if making a difficult decision. "What do I need to do?" "Just keep going as usual. Don't let Ortega suspect anything. And when it all starts, be ready to leave town quickly." Leaving the cafe, Steve drove to his safe house. Mark should be reporting to Ortega about the elimination of the unknown spy now. Everything was going according to plan, but unease gnawed inside. He took an old photo from the safe. Ashley in a pink dress blowing out the candles on her birthday cake. She was 8 years old then. A month later, she disappeared. The phone vibrated, a message from Mark. "The deed is done. The boss bought it. We start in 48 hours. Steve deleted the message and took out a map of the city. It was time to prepare the escape routes. There were 2 days ahead to think through every detail of the operation. 2 days to prepare for the moment that would forever change their lives. The price of failure was too high. They all understood that. It was starting to rain outside. Steve stood by the window looking at the blurred lights of the city. Somewhere there, in a luxurious villa, his daughter was getting ready for bed, unaware that her life would soon change forever. He prayed for only one thing: that she could forgive him, for not finding her sooner, for letting her spend 7 years in captivity, for failing her then, not being able to protect her. "I'm coming for you, sweetheart," he whispered into the darkness. "Hang on." Chapter 4: Rescue. The night was moonless, as if on order. Steve lay in the tall grass on the edge of the villa grounds, watching the changing of the guard. His black tactical suit made him practically invisible in the dark. The clock showed 2:55. 5 more minutes until the start of the operation. Mark's quiet voice came over the earpiece. "Perimeter cameras are disabled. You have 10 minutes until the system reboots. Don't mess up." Steve moved forward silently. Every movement was honed to automatism, the result of endless special forces training. He slid between the trees like a shadow, avoiding lit areas. Mark had kept his word. The security guards were distracted by a false alarm on the west wing of the villa. Reaching the wall of the service building, Steve took out a special lifting device, a compact hook and cable system designed for special operations. He covered the 4 floors up in a minute. The window that Mark had left unlocked gave way without a sound. The corridor of the service rooms was empty and dimly lit. Somewhere in the distance, the voices of the security guards hurrying to the scene of the alleged perimeter breach could be heard. Steve moved along the wall, checking against the building plan which he had memorized. The kitchen should be around the next corner. The smell of fresh baked goods hit his nostrils as he approached the kitchen doors. Through a small window, he saw a teenage girl placing baking sheets on metal racks. His heart skipped a beat. Even from behind, he would recognize her anywhere, the same movements, the same tilt of the head as Lisa. Ashley. She was taller than he imagined, of course. A child grows in 7 years. Dark hair gathered in a practical bun, a simple gray dress of uniform clothing. When she turned around, he saw her face, and for a moment it was like going back 7 years, to the morning when he last drove her to school. Steve carefully pushed the door. The hinges creaked traitorously. Ashley turned sharply, grabbing a knife from the cutting board. Her eyes widened in fear. "Don't scream," he whispered, slowly raising his hands. "I won't hurt you." "Who are you?" Her voice trembled, but she held the knife firmly. "What do you want?" Instead of answering, Steve rolled up his sleeve, showing an old scar on his forearm. The mark from a burn he got when he pulled little Ashley out of a burning tent during their last family camping trip. She often asked to see this battle mark, as she called it. The knife fell from her hand, clattering on the tiled floor. Her eyes filled with tears. "Dad," she said with just her lips. The next moment she was already in his arms, burying her face in his shoulder, as she had done as a child. Her body was shaking with a silent tremor. "I thought you had forgotten about me," she sobbed. "All these years." "Never," he whispered, holding her tighter. "We were looking for you. We were looking for you all this time." The sound of approaching footsteps made them jump apart. Steve instantly tensed, ready to fight. Ashley put her finger to her lips and gestured toward the pantry door. They barely had time to hide among the shelves of food when a security guard entered the kitchen. "What's that noise?" His voice sounded suspicious. "I thought I heard something." "Sorry, Mr. Rodriguez." Ashley's voice sounded completely calm, although Steve could feel her hand trembling in his. "I dropped a baking sheet. I'm preparing breakfast for the morning shift." The security guard hesitated, looking around the room. His hand was on the holster. Mark's anxious voice came over the earpiece. "You have problems. Johnson noticed a trace on the wall where you climbed up. They are starting a general inspection of the building." "All right," Rodriguez finally grumbled. "Just keep it down and don't stay up too late." As soon as his footsteps faded, Steve pulled his daughter toward the exit. "We need to get out of here, now." "Wait," Ashley darted to her locker and took out a small backpack. "I've been packing it for a long time. Every night I hoped someone would come." They moved down the corridor, trying to walk silently. Steve in the lead, Ashley following, exactly repeating his movements. The emergency exit was 30 meters away when lights appeared at the far end of the corridor. "Check all rooms," a commanding voice rang out. "The boss wants to know who broke into the grounds." "Run," Steve commanded, pushing the door of the emergency staircase. They raced down the steps, skipping 2 or 3 at a time. Behind them, a shout and the sound of footsteps. They had been noticed. The first bullet hit the wall next to Steve's head, showering them with plaster chips. He turned around, drawing his pistol, and fired twice up the stairs, not aiming, just to make the pursuers lie down. "Mark," he breathed into the microphone, "we need cover." "I'm working on it," came the reply. In the same second, a deafening explosion rang out somewhere above. Mark activated previously placed flashbang grenades on the upper floors. Taking advantage of the security guards' momentary confusion, they burst through the fire exit. Cold night air hit their faces. Steve got his bearings. It was about 200 meters through the park to the parked car. "Don't stop," he threw to his daughter. "Whatever happens, run to the black Ford outside the gate." In Ortega's office, chaos reigned. The drug lord darted between the surveillance system monitors, his usually cold face contorted with rage. On one of the screens, 2 figures were crossing the park, rapidly approaching the outer perimeter. "How did they get through the security system?" he roared, slamming his fist on the table. "Where the heck is Baker?" "Boss," one of the guards burst into the office. "We found disabled cameras in the east sector. Someone deliberately created a blind spot." Ortega froze. His eyes narrowed as he turned to the head of security, who had access to the system. "Only you, me, and Baker," the guard almost whispered the last word, realizing its significance. "Find him," Ortega's voice turned icy. "Dead or alive, and get me the girl back, immediately." Meanwhile, Steve and Ashley reached the hedge separating the park from the driveway. Two figures with weapons emerged from the darkness. Steve pushed his daughter behind the trunk of an old oak tree and opened fire. One of the attackers fell. The second lay down behind the fountain. "Dad!" Ashley's cry made him turn around. A group of guards was approaching from the house. They were trapped. Suddenly, the night silence was broken by a burst of automatic fire. But they were not being shot as someone opened fire on the approaching security group, forcing them to seek cover. On the roof of the service building, Steve noticed a familiar silhouette. "Get out of here," Mark's voice in the earpiece sounded strained. "I'll hold them off." "Mark! Get out of here, darn you, I can handle it." He and Ashley ran to the gate. Behind them, shots rang out. Mark continued to cover their retreat, methodically blocking any attempts at pursuit. The black Ford was standing where they had agreed. Steve pushed his daughter into the back seat and jumped behind the wheel. The engine roared, the tires squealed on the asphalt. In the rearview mirror, he could see new outbreaks of fire on the villa grounds. Mark had created real chaos to distract attention from the fugitives. They raced down the deserted highway. Ashley in the back seat was quietly sobbing, realizing that the nightmare of the last 7 years was finally over. Steve dialed a number on the secure phone. "Lisa, we're coming." "Yes, she's with us. Wait at the agreed location." He turned onto the mountain road leading to the abandoned hunting base where they had agreed to meet. It was safe there. Mark had personally checked this place and confirmed that it was not being tracked by the cartel. "Dad," Ashley called quietly, "and the person who helped us, will he be okay?" Steve gripped the steering wheel tighter. "He's a soldier, honey, one of the best I know. He'll get out." The mountain base loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the pre-dawn sky. Lisa's car was parked at the entrance. Steve slowed down, peering into the darkness. Was there any surveillance? Everything was clear. Lisa ran out to meet them as soon as they stopped. Mother and daughter stood for a moment, looking at each other, and then rushed into an embrace. Steve watched them, feeling a lump rising in his throat. His family was finally reunited. But the price of that reunification had not yet been paid in full. Somewhere there, in Ortega's mansion, his friend was risking his life to give them this chance. Chapter 5: Retribution. The first rays of sun painted the mountains pink as Steve dialed the number of Jim Hendricks, the FBI Deputy Director for Special Operations. His hands were still slightly trembling from the adrenaline rush of the night. In the next room of the hunting lodge, Lisa and Ashley were sleeping, under one roof for the first time in 7 years. "Jim, it's Connor. Remember our conversation about the Ortega cartel? It's time to act. I have everything we need." He methodically laid out the facts collected over the past weeks. Documents from Lisa's hard drive, proving coercion to cooperate. Recordings of Ortega's conversations with corrupt officials. Money laundering schemes through shell companies. A list of murdered witnesses. And most importantly, Lisa's testimony about Ashley's kidnapping and years of blackmail. "How long do you need?" Hendricks's voice sounded extremely collected. 2 hours. Make sure the capture team consists only of vetted people. Ortega has too many friends in law enforcement. Finishing the conversation, Steve went out to the porch. The morning air was crystal clear, filled with the scent of pines. Somewhere in the distance a bird cried. Such a peaceful morning and such a contrast to what was about to happen. Exactly at 7 in the morning, 5 FBI SWAT teams surrounded the territory of Ortega's villa. They operated as a single mechanism, the result of many hours of training. Snipers took positions on neighboring hills. Assault teams at all exits. A support helicopter hovered at a safe altitude. Ramon Ortega, a voice from the megaphone shattered the morning silence. The building is surrounded. Come out with your hands up. The servants were the first to surrender: cooks, gardeners, maids. They were quickly evacuated to a safe place. Then the security guards began to come out, those who realized that resistance was futile. They were disarmed and laid face down on the ground. Ortega himself barricaded himself in the office on the second floor. Through the scope of the sniper's optical sight, Steve saw the drug lord darting between the windows, shouting orders to his people and the police on the phone. But it was too late. His friends in law enforcement were themselves under arrest in a simultaneous operation in the city. The assault began without warning. Capture groups stormed the building from 3 sides simultaneously. Through cameras mounted on the operatives' helmets, Steve watched the operation from the mobile command center. Resistance was minimal. Most of the security guards had already surrendered. Ortega met the assault team with fire from automatic weapons. Bullets riddled the walls of the corridor, but no one was hurt. Body armor and shields did their job. When the ammunition ran out, the drug lord threw a tear gas grenade at the operatives, trying to buy time. "I have an offer," he shouted as the smoke cleared. "I know everyone, all the names, all the accounts, all the safe houses. I can hand you half the state government." Steve shook his head, hearing these shouts through his earpiece. A typical tactic of a cornered criminal to try to bargain. But this time it won't work. Too many witnesses, too much evidence. And most importantly, the kidnapping of a federal agent's child. You don't bargain for that. Ramon Ortega, the assault team commander's voice was calm and methodical. "You have 30 seconds to come out with your hands up. Otherwise, we will use force." The drug lord chose a third path. When the SWAT team stormed the office, he was sitting at the desk with a gun to his temple. His once impeccable suit was rumpled, sweat dripped down his face. "Don't come near," his voice cracked into a squeal. "I'd rather die than go to jail." "Lower your weapon, Mr. Ortega," the group commander said. "You don't want your daughter to remember you like this." That worked. The hand with the gun trembled. How do you know about my daughter?" "We know everything, Mr. Ortega, about your family in Mexico, about the accounts in the Cayman Islands, about the secret bunker under the villa. The game is over." The gun clattered to the table. When handcuffs clicked on Ortega's wrists, he looked 20 years older. All his power, all his arrogance had evaporated, leaving only a frightened man who realized that his empire had collapsed. In the corner of the room, pressed against the wall, sat Mark Baker. His left arm was bandaged with a bloody rag, traces of the night's shootout. When the SWAT officers pointed their weapons at him, he slowly raised his good hand. "I surrender," he simply said. "My name is Mark Baker. I am ready to testify against the cartel." Over the next 2 days, Mark testified at the FBI regional office. He spoke non-stop, methodically describing every cartel operation, every deal, every murder. Steve attended the interrogations, watching his friend free himself from the burden of 7 years of silence. "I want it to be recorded," Mark said, looking directly into the camera, "that Agent Connor was unaware of my role in the organization until the last moment. His only goal was to rescue his daughter. I voluntarily offered assistance, based on our past cooperation in the military." The federal prosecutor, a young woman with a piercing gaze, carefully studied the documents. "Mr. Baker, do you understand that your testimony may be used against you?" "I understand. I am willing to bear the punishment for my actions, but I ask that you take into account my cooperation with the investigation and my help in freeing Ashley Connor." Steve testified next. He described in detail how Mark helped plan and carry out the operation to rescue Ashley, risking his own life. How he covered their retreat, giving them time to escape. How his information helped conduct a successful storming of the villa. "Without Mark Baker, the operation would have been impossible," he concluded. He atoned for his mistakes by saving an innocent child. A week later, a preliminary hearing was held. Mark faced up to 20 years in prison for conspiracy to commit crimes within a criminal organization. But thanks to Steve's testimony, and taking into account his substantial assistance to the investigation, the judge agreed to a plea bargain: 2 years in a minimum security prison with the right to parole for good behavior. After the sentencing, Steve waited at the exit of the courtroom. When Mark was led out in handcuffs, their eyes met. "I'll arrange a meeting with your family," Steve said quietly. "They should know the truth. They should understand why you made the choices you did." "Do you think they can forgive me?" For the first time in all this time, Mark's voice held uncertainty. "Sarah loves you. All these years she kept your pictures, told Jake about his hero father. Give them a chance to understand." Mark nodded, trying to hold back the tears that were welling in his eyes. The guard tactfully turned away, pretending to study something in his papers. "Thank you, Steve, for everything. It's me who should be thanking you, for my daughter, for my family." As Mark was led away, Steve stood in the empty corridor of the courthouse for a long time. A light rain was drizzling outside, but for the first time in many years, he felt that justice had been served. Not perfect, not absolute, but humane. The kind of justice that gives people a chance for redemption. Chapter 6: A New Life. 1 year later. Dr. Sarah Reynolds' office was located on the 3rd floor of the Psychological Rehabilitation Center. Bright room with large windows, comfortable chairs, soft lighting, everything was conducive to a confidential conversation. Ashley sat in her favorite chair, tucking her legs under her, and talked about her week. Over the past year, she had changed noticeably. The hunted look had disappeared, her posture had straightened, and her voice had gained confidence. "I started cooking at home," she said, and her eyes shone. "You know, before, the kitchen reminded me of the villa of that time. But now it's different. Mom bought me a cookbook, and we cook together. Yesterday I made lasagna Dad said he'd never eaten anything so delicious." Dr. Reynolds made notes in her notepad, gently smiling from time to time. She had been seeing Ashley since the first day of her release and had seen every small step on the road to recovery. The first weeks were the hardest: nightmares, panic attacks, inability to be in enclosed spaces. But gradually, day by day, Ashley learned to live again. "And how are your relationships with your parents?" the doctor asked. "You said you sometimes feel like an outsider." "It's better now," Ashley thoughtfully twisted a strand of hair. "You know, at first it was weird. They remembered me as a little girl, and I've changed so much, but we are learning to understand each other. Dad takes me to baseball games, we used to go a lot, and Mom, she just hugs me when things get tough. Doesn't ask questions, just hugs." Footsteps were heard in the corridor. It was time to end the session. Ashley stood up, smoothing the wrinkles on her new dress. No more uniform clothing, no more gray maid's outfits. "See you next week, Dr. Reynolds," she smiled. "I'll bring you my lasagna. I promise you've never tasted anything like it." Lisa was waiting for her in the waiting room. Mother and daughter hugged, a simple gesture that seemed impossible just a year ago. They walked to the car, talking animatedly about something. Dr. Reynolds watched them go, thinking about how much love and patience it takes to heal the wounds of the past. But this family was coping day after day, step by step. It was quiet at the Oak Hill minimum security prison. Sarah and Jake sat at a table in the visiting room, waiting for Mark to be brought in. Over the past year, they had not missed a single authorized visit. Jake, now a 13-year-old teenager, nervously tugged at the sleeve of his sweater. He was still a little shy about these meetings, although he was beginning to get used to the idea that his father was alive. When Mark appeared in his gray prison robe, Sarah's face lit up. She still loved him despite the 7 years of separation, despite his past. Or maybe it was because of that past, now she knew the whole story, understood why he had made such a choice. "Hey, champ," Mark hugged his son. "How's your baseball going?" The coach says I'm doing well at second base. Jake visibly perked up. Next Saturday is an important game. Mr. Connor promised to come and watch. Steve is helping with the training, Sarah explained. He spends a lot of time with Jake. Mark nodded gratefully. Steve had kept his word, not only helped his family financially, but also became something of an uncle, an older friend to Jake. That was important. The boy needed a male role model while his father was serving his sentence. I got a job, Mark said, looking at his wife. That is, I'll get it when I get out. Steve arranged it with a security firm. They take former military. Honest work, good pay. Our house is waiting for you, Sarah replied quietly. I've kept everything as it was. I just replaced the carpet in the living room, the one you never liked. They laughed so easily and sincerely for the first time in a long time. Jake watched his parents with surprise. He hardly remembered them laughing together. In the glass booth, the guard coughed delicately. Visiting time was coming to an end. Mark hugged his son, kissed his wife. Parting was not so painful now. They knew he would be home soon. His behavior had been exemplary, and the lawyer hired by Steve had already filed paperwork for parole. Steve was waiting for them at the exit of the prison. He had brought Sarah and Jake in his car, as he had done every week for the past year. While Jake was telling Ashley about his upcoming game, Sarah looked at the towering walls of Oak Hill. A little longer, she thought. Just a little longer, and their family would be together again. The Terre Haute, federal high-security prison towered over the barren landscape like a medieval fortress. In a solitary confinement cell, separated from the other prisoners, Ramon Ortega whiled away his days. The former arrogance had evaporated, leaving only a shadow of the once powerful drug lord. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Most of his people received long sentences. Corrupt police officers, judges, officials, all who had helped the cartel for years ended up behind bars. The empire he had built for 20 years crumbled like a house of cards. And all because of one mistake. He underestimated the power of parental love, deciding to use a federal agent's child as a pawn in his game. Lisa returned to her law practice, but now she specialized in defending the rights of children. Her experience and understanding of what families of missing children go through made her one of the most respected specialists in this area. She worked with charitable organizations, helping parents not lose hope and fight for their children. Their marriage to Steve was slowly recovering. The wounds of the past had not completely disappeared, but they learned to talk about them openly. Every evening they gathered for family dinner, a tradition that Ashley had suggested. She cooked her signature dishes and they talked about everything, catching up on lost years. One of those evenings there was a knock at the door. Mark stood on the threshold. He had been released a day earlier than scheduled for good behavior. Next to him were Sarah and Jake, all dressed up. In Mark's hands was a bottle of wine and a box of cake. "Hope we're not late," he smiled. Ashley ran out into the hallway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Just in time. The lasagna is almost ready." They sat down at the large table in the living room, the Connors and the Bakers, two families whose destinies had intertwined in the most unexpected way. Jake was enthusiastically telling Ashley about his victory at the school baseball championship. Lisa and Sarah were discussing plans for the summer vacation. Mark and Steve sat next to each other, as in the old days in Afghanistan, only now instead of army rations, they had homemade food in front of them. "To family," Steve raised his glass, "to those who never give up." "To second chances," Mark added, looking at his wife and son. "To a new life," Ashley said quietly. Outside the window, the sunset was burning out, painting the sky in golden tones. Somewhere in the distance a dog was barking, children were playing. An ordinary evening in the suburbs, but for them it meant much more. It was the evening when all the scars of the past finally began to heal, when the future no longer frightened with uncertainty. An evening when justice and mercy found a way to coexist, giving hope for redemption even to those who seem to have lost it forever. If you like this story, then support the author with a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your emotions in the comments. Thank you.